Hello, my name is Bernard. This is my wife Jane. We have 4 children: Claire, who is 6, Louise, who is 5, Nicholas, who's 2, and Isabel, who's about to turn 1. We've been involved with the Schoenstatt movement since we got married in 2012, and for the last 5 years we've been members of one of the movement family groups. We're very happy you could join us tonight in our newly consecrated home shrine, the Ark.
This is the first of a new approach to the Covenant Sunday celebrations. For those who are not able to attend in person at one of the shrines, a video like this will be prepared by a different movement member each month and uploaded to the Schoenstatt Australia YouTube channel. If you are watching this online, do not forget to renew the covenant with a spiritual visit to the shrine.
We've been asked to offer the reflection for the January Covenant Day. The theme of our Covenant Days in 2021 will be Family, Be What You Are, Domestic Church. The hope is that through these sessions, all of us will deepen our appreciation of domestic church, how we can better live and proclaim it. For some of you, the term domestic church may easily resonate with your natural family. But for all, including those who live alone or who are not married, we're also speaking about life as part of our Schoenstatt family. As well as discussing the theology of the church and the family, we will explore how we can practically take our family and the love we're meant to be living into the world. By being what we're called to be in our homes and in our movement, we will engage more deeply and authentically with those we encounter.
In deciding upon this theme at the 2020 October conference, the hope was that in spending a year deepening our understanding of the domestic church, we would at the same time be challenged to find new ways to share Schoenstatt's riches and find the courage to try out new initiatives. And certainly the coronavirus pandemic has made the whole world embrace new initiatives. So this is the right year to cast out into the deep, maybe sailing in ways we have not sailed before. This deeper discovery of the domestic church should make us want to 1. Go where we are needed, 2. Take our mother with us, and 3. Trust blindly in divine providence. The topic of our talk is the family, church in miniature, and we will discuss the topic in 6 small sections. 1. Defining the church. 2. Defining the domestic church. 3. Interdependency. 4. The reality of our natural family. 5. The reality of the Schoenstatt family. And 6. Living in the mess. We will then conclude with a couple of questions for reflection and discussion.
So section 1, defining the church. If we're going to talk about the church, we should begin by defining what it is. Those who do not share our faith will most likely think that the church refers to a building or to the Vatican, and neither is completely correct. At the most basic level, the church is the united people of God. That is, the people of God gathered, but not gathered for a picnic, gathered to worship ultimately. Immediately following the fall of our first parents, God reached out and began preparing humanity to one day become part of the church. God established covenants with Noah, Abraham, Moses and David, until he offered the covenant with the whole world through his Son. It was Christ who instituted the church as part of the Father's plan for our salvation, and as the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, the church is, quote, in history, but at the same time transcending it. It is right to say that the church is a perfect institution, but it is also right to understand that the problems we recognise in the church are because it is made up of sinners. It is the imperfect activity of its members that leads those outside the church, and sometimes even those inside, to consider the church not as the bride of Christ, but at best a charitable institution, and at worst a corrupt and evil entity. We cannot succumb to either, but need to continue to remind ourselves that the church is indeed founded by Christ, protected by the Holy Spirit, and that properly understood, there is no salvation outside the church. If you're interested in reading more about the church, I direct you to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the Vatican II document Lumen Gentium, or a lesser known but powerful declaration released in the year 2000 called Dominus Jesus.
Section 2, defining the domestic church. So, what about the domestic church? The domestic church is most simply and beautifully, and as the title of this talk indicates, a church in miniature. It is the presence of God lived out through the home, and not only lived out, but imaged through the love of husband and wife, made fruitful in the blessing of their children. Just as the church is a community, so too is the domestic church. And we would add that every home, no matter whether it contains one person or 10, should become a domestic church where Christ is Lord. In his apostolic exhortation, Familiaris Consortio, Pope John Paul II said, "The family, which is founded and given life by love, is a community of persons, of husband and wife, of parents and children, of relatives. The family's inner principle is love. Without love, the family cannot live, grow, and perfect itself. Without love, man remains incomprehensible to himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed in him." It is through the family that each of us learns to love. To the extent that the family, that school of love, as John Paul II also called it, is properly lived out and encountered, is the extent to which most of us will understand love and our place in the church. Without that environment in which we experience and practice love, we can never truly understand or be ourselves. Whatever undermines the family, therefore, hurts its members and indeed undermines our whole society.
Section 3, Interdependency. Hopefully you can see how these two divine realities of church and domestic church are so intertwined. The church relies on the authenticity of its members, who know and seek love and truth, while the domestic church relies on the church to teach, govern and sanctify, in order that its members will learn to love each other and God.
Here are some parallels that we came up with between the church and the domestic church. In the church, we receive grace through the sacraments. In the domestic church, we open ourselves to the grace that is available to us through our respective vocations. Through the church, we are taught about the sacred mysteries. In the domestic church, we find formation through each stage of life. In the church, we gather as large community. In the domestic church, we gather as a personal and intimate community. As a church, we break bread. As a domestic church, we share meals and are nourished together. They say that the family that prays together stays together, but I think equally, the family that eats together stays together. As the bride of Christ, the church is called to respond to the voice of the bridegroom. The domestic church is also a place of listening and discerning. All vocations ultimately begin in the home. In the book Family at the Service of Life, a series of recollection days for couples, Father Kentenich says, "My family is a seminary for priests. My family, I could also say, is a seminary for marriage. All the great things that will one day break into the life of the child, whether that child should become a priest, sister, or marry, may and must be laid down as a foundation in the family."
In these and many other possible examples, we can see that the domestic church provides a tangible context for the faith of the church to be taken from theory into practice, be it in grace, education, service, community, or worship. In the home are faith, hope and love practiced. In the home are the corporal works of mercy lived out. In the home are the fruits of the Holy Spirit made manifest. There can be a real temptation to strive for grand and noticeable activity in the church, preparing large talks and creating broad programs. However, we cannot cast aside the activity of the domestic church. A mother caring for a baby, a husband loving his wife, a sister helping a neighbour. These are one-on-one encounters, and we see that in the life of the Lord. More often than not, he was ministering person to person. He spoke to a woman at a well. He healed a blind man. He brought back life to a child. You'll further see in this interdependency our covenant of love. the demands and the promises, nothing without you, nothing without us. The grace of the shrine and the original consecration of the founding generation was an entrustment of heart to heart. 107 years later, every grace and blessing of our movement continues to be built on this partnership.
Section 4, the reality of our natural family. In light of this, I would like to share a little about the reality of our own domestic church. Over the last few years, I have been listening to a Catholic podcast called the Messi Families Project. And while I recommend it as a great resource for Catholic parents, I must say that I was sold as soon as I heard the name, Messi Families. It is just so true and definitely our experience. Family life is messy, really messy. It does sound funny, but it is the simple reality. It is hard to live it, and sometimes it feels like an ongoing cross. To be perfectly honest, we have on many occasions asked ourselves where the alleged blessings are in family life. Sure, there are moments of joy and pride, but most of the time, and we can only talk about our own experience of having 4 young children, but it is tiring and unrelenting.
I think also, especially as both Jane and I are people of high ideals, and precisely because we're wanting to be intentional parents, we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves because all the plans and hopes we have for the children need to move from the paper into reality. And the reality does not stop, it's ever changing. Perhaps if we have one child who stayed the same age for a few years, we'll have it under control. But we can certainly affirm that children who continue to grow make the need for family sanctification a real necessity.
So section number 5, the reality of our Schoenstatt family. The same can be said of our Schoenstatt family, which is also imperfect. We have high ideals and many different people, each with different levels of dedication and commitment. But we still struggle to share with the wider church the gift of what we have. It can be a frustration that we are not bigger or more well known, or we do not have more vocations to the various branches. But like the natural family, our Schoenstatt family is not judged by the size of its membership list, but by the authenticity of the hearts and lives of its members. Our founder, Father Kentenich, was quoted as saying, "Our hearts belong to all the members of the family. My heart belongs to you. Your hearts belong to me. And our hearts belong to one another." If we are thus a community of hearts, in a union of hearts with God the Father, then we have the most solid foundation for the history of the family in times to come. Father wanted us to know and not forget that ours is a community of hearts. Truly a community of persons serving life and acting as the leaven in the dough and the light on the hill.
Section 6, living in the mess. Your house and your life may be more ordered than ours, but each of us has our own messiness somewhere. And it's important to realise that. Before I was married, I was privileged to spend some time in the seminary where I was able to dwell on the finer points of theology and encounter beautiful solemn liturgies, both of which simply cannot feature as part of our lives at this time. Of course, the life of the seminarian, priest or religious is not free of challenges either, but having encountered the difference between those vocations, I think it can be a trap for us to allow ourselves to think that a truly spiritual and faithful life is a life that looks like the saints on a holy card. I'm not discounting the place of beautiful religious images, but the Christian life is messy, and I think that's the way it's meant to be. Really, there's no other option because we live in a fallen world. In fact, one of the tools of the devil is almost certainly to allow us to think that if our spiritual life does not look like a holy card or the beautiful inside of the shrine, then there's something wrong with it. For us, that is the big lesson, to know where we are and learn to love from there.
In conclusion, we see the reality of the church and the domestic church. We realise that we need one another. We know the life to which we've been called, both in our natural family and in our Schoenstatt family. We are, however, confronted daily with our own shortcomings and the limits that set in due to our personal weaknesses and the external and internal situations we find ourselves in. Interestingly, due to COVID, we have seen the walls of the church move quite literally into the walls of the domestic church, as many of us were subjected to living our liturgical and faith lives from home. There's been a new fusing of the church and the domestic church, and there are opportunities that have never presented themselves before.
We hope that these few thoughts have been of interest and that they spur reflection and discussion on how you see the church and the domestic church, but more importantly, what that means for the way we live our personal lives, our faith lives, and our lives as part of the Schoenstatt movement. We'll end with a beautiful quote from Father Jonathan Niehaus, a Schoenstatt father, who prepared for our 2011 National Conference, although he died before that conference took place, or just after the conference. He says, "We are a family of Mary. With the helplessness and limitations, we are a family of Mary. With our abilities and possibilities, we are a family of Mary. With our diversity of background and longings, we are a family of Mary. With our mission, great and small, we are a family of Mary. With the shrine as our home fire and our lighthouse, we are a family of Mary. With one another and with all our hearts, we are a family of Mary."
Beautiful. We will leave you with 2 reflection questions. The first, look at your own domestic church, whatever that looks like, and consider what is going well, what can be improved. Think about what you can bring, maybe what you can receive. Is it forgiveness, charity, hope, etc.? Instead of thinking big, let us take time to think small. As Father Kentenich said, do ordinary things extraordinarily well. And the second reflection question, how does the reality of your own domestic church position you to serve the wider church, specifically in the context of our Schoenstatt movement? That is all from us. Thank you, and may God bless you.